My son opened the door and said, "Dad, this is not a good time." I walked back to my car. 6 months later, he called and I let it ring because I was signing papers that would make him understand what he lost. I want to tell you something before I get into this. I am 64 years old. I spent 31 years with BC Telecom and then with TELUS after the merger. Working my way from a field technician in my 20s to a senior network infrastructure engineer by the time I retired. I built a career the way my father taught me to build things. One solid piece at a time, no shortcuts, no drama. My name is Geoffrey. I live in Nanaimo, British Columbia, and the story I am about to tell you is not about bitterness. It is not about rage. It is about a single quiet moment standing on a porch in the rain and everything that followed from it. I need you to understand what my life looked like before that moment, because none of what came after makes sense without. But before, I had been married to my wife Carolyn for 36 years. We raised 2 children together, Preston, our son, who is 36 now, and our daughter Mara, who is 33. We owned a home in Nanaimo outright. We had savings. We had RRSPs. We had a modest investment portfolio that I had been adding to since my late 30s. Not wealthy by any measure, but stable. It's the kind of stable that takes a lifetime to build. Then Caroline got sick. I will not go into the details because they are not mine to share publicly. What I will tell you is that her illness lasted for years and that caring for her properly cost everything we had built. Not because the system failed us entirely, but because there are costs that do not show up on any government form. Private care, specialized equipment, the modifications we made to our home. The months I stopped working entirely because she needed someone there. You spend it because she is your wife and because there is no other option that you can live with. Afterward, Carolyn passed away 14 months before the moment I am about to describe to you. By the time the estate was settled and the final medical bills were cleared, I had the car, a storage unit, and enough in a checking account to last me approximately 4 months if I was careful. I had already sold the house. I was staying in a short-term rental in a part of Nanaimo I had never spent much time in. I was 63 years old, recently widowed, and starting over from a position I had never imagined occupying. I want to say I handled that period with complete dignity. Some days, I did. Other days, I sat in a folding chair in that rental unit and looked at the wall for an hour without moving. Preston lives in Victoria. He bought a house there 5 years ago with his partner Diane. It is a good house in a good neighborhood. He works in financial services, not as an advisor, but in a mid-level operations role. He earns a comfortable living. He has always been careful with money, which I respected. He called me occasionally during Caroline's illness. He visited twice in 4 years, both times briefly. I did not hold that against him. People have their own lives. After Caroline passed, the calls became less frequent. I understood that too. Grief is uncomfortable for people who are not inside it. I reached out to Preston about 3 months after I had sold the house. I told him in a phone call that things were more difficult than I had anticipated. I did not ask for money. I was not calling to ask to move in. I was calling the way a father calls a son when things are hard, not to transfer the weight, but to be heard for a moment. He was polite, said things like, "That sounds really tough, and let me know if there is anything we can do." The call lasted 11 minutes. Nothing changed. 2 months later, I drove to Victoria. I did not call ahead. I know that sounds strange, but I had thought about it and decided that if I called, he would prepare a response, and I wanted to speak to him the way people used to speak to each other, face to face without a script. I had a specific thing. I wanted to ask not for money, not to move in permanently. I wanted to ask if I could stay in his guest room for 60 days while I got stable enough to secure a proper lease somewhere. 2 months I would have been invisible. I drove the ferry and then drove to his neighborhood and parked in front of his house. It was an October evening. It had been raining most of the day and was still misting when I walked up to the front door. Preston opened it before I could knock a second time. I could see past him into the house. The lights were warm. The television was on in the other room. Dinner smelled like it was nearly ready. He looked at me. I could see him processing the visit, processing the fact that I had shown up without calling, processing whatever he saw on my face. Then he said, "Dad, this is not a good time." He said it quietly, not cruelly, the way you might tell a neighbor who has come by to chat that you are in the middle of something. Measured, polite, final. I looked at him for a moment. I nodded. I said, "Okay," and I walked back to my car. I did not cry in the driveway. I did not sit there for a long time. I drove to a Tim Hortons near the ferry terminal, and I ordered a coffee, and I sat at a table by the window, and I watched the rain on the glass, and I made a decision. Not an angry decision, not a dramatic one, just a quiet, clear, final one. From this moment forward, I would rebuild entirely on my own. And whatever I built and whatever I had left when I was done would reflect with complete accuracy who had shown up for me and who had not. That was it. No speech, no confrontation. No phone call to Preston that night to tell him what he had done. I just decided in the way that you decide something when you are 63. And you have nothing left to lose from being honest with yourself. I drove back to Nanaimo on the late ferry. I went to sleep. The next morning, I started making calls. I want to tell you about a man named Howard. Howard and I had worked together on a provincial infrastructure contract back in 2009. He had gone on to build a small but profitable telecommunications consulting firm. We had stayed loosely in touch over the years, the occasional email, a coffee when we were in the same city. Not close friends, but solid. I called him the morning after Victoria and told him I was looking for work, not charity work. I was a 31-year veteran with deep technical knowledge, good client relationships, and no overhead. I told him I would take a contract role, a part-time role, whatever he had. Howard paused on the phone for a moment. Then he said he did not have a job for me exactly, but he had something else he wanted to discuss. We met for lunch 2 days later. Howard told me he had been approached by a former client who wanted to establish a small commercial telecom consulting operation focused on municipal contracts in mid-sized BC cities. Exactly the kind of work I had spent years doing inside a large corporation. Howard had the relationships. I had the technical credibility. Neither of us had the capital to launch it alone, but together. With a specific client already interested, the startup costs were manageable. He offered me a silent partnership, equal equity. I would contribute technical leadership and my existing professional reputation. He would front the initial costs and manage the administrative side. I would defer my draw for the first 4 months, and then begin earning from contract revenue. I took it. I will not pretend those 4 months were comfortable. I was careful with every dollar. I renewed my short-term rental month by month. I ate simply. I did not complain to anyone, but by the A. 5th month, we had our first municipal contract. By the 4th month after that, we had 2 more. By the end of 6 months, I had drawn enough to stabilize myself completely and had begun saving again. And then our first significant revenue split hit my account. I sat with my accountant in Nanaimo and we looked at the numbers, and then I made another phone call. This time to a commercial real estate agent I had done business with years earlier through a colleague. Within 6 weeks, I had identified a small commercial property in Nanaimo, a mixed-use building, ground floor retail space to residential units above, modest, solid, generating consistent rental income, the kind of asset that, if managed carefully, holds value for decades. I made an offer. It was accepted. Closing was scheduled. On the morning of the closing, I drove to my lawyer's office in downtown Nanaimo and sat across from her at a long table covered in documents. The property would be transferred into a holding structure we had established, a numbered company of trays, a numbered company of which I was the sole director and which would be governed by a detailed estate plan I had finalized the week before. The estate plan was simple and precise. My daughter Mara was the sole named beneficiary. Preston was not named. Not as a contingency. Not in a reduced capacity. Not at all. I was in the middle of signing when my phone lit up on the table. Preston. I looked at the screen for one full ring. My lawyer looked at me. I turned the phone face down on the table and kept signing. When we were finished, I shook my lawyer's hand, walked to my car, and called Mara to tell her what I had done and why. She was quiet for a long time, and she said, "Dad, I'm really sorry he did that to you." I told her not to be sorry. I told her I was fine. I called Preston back that evening, not to explain, not to confront. Just because I am 64 years old and I do not want to be the kind of man who lets calls go unreturned forever. He asked how I was. I told him I was well. He said he had been meaning to reach out for a while. I said I figured. There was a pause. He asked if we could get together sometime soon. I said, sure, sometime. We've not gotten together yet. I do not know what Preston thinks happened during these 6 months. I do not know what story he has told himself about that evening on the porch, or about my silence in the months that followed, or about what I was doing while he was not calling. But I know what I signed that morning, and I know that the building I now own and the business I built from a lunch conversation and a firm handshake belong entirely to a version of me that Preston said was not a good time for. I do not need him to understand that today. Maybe he will understand it one day. Maybe he will not. Either way, the papers are signed. Some doors close you out so completely that when you find your own way back in, you realize the lock was never on the door. It was always on you, and you already had the key. If this story made you think about someone in your own life, stay and think about it. If you're going through something like this yourself, I hope you heard something useful here. And if you are new here, this channel is called Revenge Justice Stories, and there is a lot more where this came from. Take care of yourselves,